Hey everyone, thank you very much for joining us today in the morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world. We'd love to hear where you're from, so if you could drop in the chat where you're dialing in from today, that would be fantastic. And today we're going to be talking about metadata and dependencies. And although you may or may not have dived into these topics in detail, they're vitally important to ensuring a high-performing, scalable Salesforce that hopefully is as fast as lightning and has minimal bugs. And today we're partnering with Elements.cloud. So we did a webinar with Xavier and Elements a few weeks ago, and I think it was the most popular webinar we've ever done. So Xavier and Elements are back. So let's get started. So just a few things before we jump in. So this is a webinar, so all lines are muted. We will be having a Q&A at the end. So if you just drop any questions that you've got throughout the session in the chat box, we'll get around to as many as we can at the end. And this is being recorded as well. So this is being streamed on YouTube as well, in case you've got any issues with LinkedIn. And then it will live on YouTube afterwards as a saved live event. And just to introduce myself, so my name is Ben McCarthy. I'm founder of Salesforce Ben, and I'm going to be your host today. And I'll be back at the end to do the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Xavier to take us through the topic. See you in a bit, Xavier.
Thank you so much, Ben. Welcome, everyone. No pressure. Last webinar was very popular. Hopefully this one will not disappoint. So today's agenda, we will start with the basic. What is Salesforce metadata? And then we'll jump straight into why is managing Salesforce metadata actually the biggest problem facing any org. I will then quickly, managing metadata is an enormous area in and of itself, and you can actually divide it into a change intelligence problem space and a DevOps problem space, and I will explain the differences between the two. And then we will very much focus on the org management issues that kind of fall under the change intelligence problematic. Alrighty, let's get started. So first, let's just cover the basics. What is metadata? It's a very technical term. The standard definition is just data that provides information about other data, but not the content of the data. To make it slightly less, dictionary-esque, let's break it down. Salesforce, when we talk about Salesforce metadata, we fundamentally talk about the stuff that defines your configuration. So object is a metadata, field is a metadata, flow is a metadata, Apex class. If you think about any of those items and many others, Apex class behaves in a certain way, and flow can behave in a certain way, and flow can do certain things that, let's say, an assignment rule can't, and an object, custom object, can do certain things, or can be used in a certain ways that, let's say, platform events can be used as such, and vice versa. That is metadata. So there's that describes how these things behave. All right. And before we get started, it's also worth pointing out that Salesforce is a metadata platform. Actually, a couple of years back, there was an interview with Parker Harris, the CTO and co-founder of Salesforce, who very much said that the vision from the get-go was to invent a metadata-driven platform. In other words, something that is so customizable that without needing really to code that much, this can be customized to serve both small company and a big company in Bay Area, as well as Australia or anywhere around the world. So concept of metadata and metadata management is almost the foundation of what made Salesforce successful. So when we talk about metadata-driven configuration, what's the blessing and what's the curse of that situation? Well, on the one hand, because metadata is so easy to use and it's mostly declarative, other than your Apex classes and triggers and Visualforce pages, you can customize so many things in Salesforce just with drag and drop and clicks and no code. You can build these very sophisticated applications to help businesses. Now, the challenge is that what that leaves us with is something like this. We end up with this very convoluted, complex set of interdependencies, and that's pretty much the face on almost every admin BA or architect, and definitely a consultant when they come in to a new org on the first day or even the 100th day and try to figure out what's what. So let's talk about some of the challenges with managing metadata and where do they come from. Well, first of all, there's a lot of it. As of summer 23, there are 628 different types of metadata. And for the most part, it doesn't even include, some of the, let's call it add-ons, doesn't include Marketing Cloud, doesn't include Tableaus and MuleSofts, all those additional components. It's just, core Salesforce metadata. Now, if you look at 65 out of those 628 metadata types, and the most used ones, right? Your objects, your fields, etc., your record types, flows, there's, by my count, about 448 possible dependencies. If you were to create a matrix of every type of metadata against every type of metadata, that list would be into thousands of possible relationships. Because of the scale of how much metadata you're actually working with, reality is you'd never know who's working on what and when. So you end up hoping and then being sadly surprised when there is a conflict that needs resolving out of the blue. There are so many metadata types. Each one of them comes with a different set of best practices and principles, what you can and should or shouldn't do. Hard-coded IDs is the obvious one. Don't hard-code IDs, by the way, anywhere. But fault coverage in flows or test coverage in Apex. And how do you actually monitor and manage that? When you use certain metadata types, you use them correctly. You set them up correctly, following all these best practices. That's actually very challenging. And then finally, deploying changes is no easy task. I mean, let's not talk about change sets, but even if you have a modern DevOps tool, planning all your deployments, doing rollbacks, planning what goes first, what goes second, there's an art and a science to doing that correctly. Now, if we look at those, and by the way, it's not to say that there aren't more problems with managing metadata, but I want to focus on these 5. Now, the first 4, the ones I've highlighted in blue, are the sort of problems that fall under the change intelligence problem space. And then the orange one, although there's more to it, falls under the traditional DevOps problem space. And let's quickly talk about that distinction, because there isn't, again, managing metadata is a very broad challenge, and you deal with them using kind of different approaches and tools. So change intelligence is an emerging domain, especially in the Salesforce ecosystem. And it's about helping organizations understand how their systems and processes are put together, and then using that knowledge to design and plan effective changes. Whereas DevOps is more about facilitating continuous integration and deployment, automating repetitive tasks, and encouraging fundamentally swift response to issues as they arise. So that sort of questions we would be asking ourselves in the change intelligence context is, what is the right solution to build? What will be the impact if I change this? What are the biggest issues facing my org or my system? And how should the change be delivered most effectively? Whereas with DevOps, the sort of questions we would traditionally be asking ourselves are more, what is the right way to release this, or what the right way to build this? How can we release this quickly? And again, more on the what changes were made and by whom. And again, I'm simplifying this somewhat because there's so much more we could get into here. But for the purpose of this presentation, I want to focus on the change intelligence problems, simply because DevOps is a pretty established space these days, and there's still a lot of underappreciation for problems that fundamentally fall under change intelligence category. So let's start with the very first challenge, which is there is a lot of metadata. And I mentioned before, 628 types of metadata available and a lot of dependencies. But what does that actually mean? metadata, again, is just the types of things you can use in your org. If we look at some of the actual numbers of components and automations and objects and fields and all the other stuff that is utilized in any org, this becomes much scarier picture. One of the customers of Elements Cloud that we once synced, more than 250,000 reports, more than 7,000 Apex classes, 347 flows, nearly 1,000 custom objects, and that's on top of all the standard objects that you already have. 413 validation rules, 50,000 custom fields, just shy of hundreds of record types. And may I just add, these numbers are just for 7 out of the 628 types of metadata we've mentioned. It's also worth saying that as far as record types and validation rules are concerned, most of those were on just a couple of objects. So the reality is that when we look at any specific Salesforce org, especially in big organizations, then there are hundreds of thousands, close to 1 million individual components that exist in an org, that run in the org, that need to be managed and understood. And that's a huge challenge. The way you deal with that in change intelligence context is you need to have some capacity or capability to have a metadata dictionary. In other words, think of this as your single source of truth, not your Salesforce setup, but rather a way of quickly seeing and categorizing all of your metadata in your org. Now, the other challenge that I briefly touched upon earlier with having so many metadata types is actually the dependencies between them, and there are just so many. Now, let me give you a very specific example from our own org, in our own Elements org. We have a stage, a field, and opportunity, and it's used in 1 Apex class, 1 email template, 4 formulas, 34 flows, 1 global action, 75 list views, 6-page layouts, 2 process builders, 265 reports, 10 validation rules. And this is not really that big. We've seen situations in orgs where 1 field is used in 3,000 reports. 1 field is used in 20 different automations. Sorry, 20 different types of automations. Now, the reason why this is challenging is if you think about some of the traditional traditional dependency analysis tools, and where is this used button in Salesforce is maybe an example of that. You end up with, well, here is where this is used. This is, I always said, this is akin to pointing a haystack to someone and saying, you see that haystack over there? Somewhere in there is anything between 1 to many needles. We will not tell you precisely how many, nor will we give you the magnet, but at least we pointed the haystack. And in this particular example, it was maybe 3 years ago, our business analysts had to update literally 2 values on stage. And going through those 30-something flows and finding every reference, he had to go block by block, element by element, 9 hours of really soul-crushing work just to find all of that. Now, the challenge with that is if that's, just knowing where a component is used and how it might impact your system will not going to necessarily make it easy for you to assess that impact. There's just too many things to assess. So in the modern change intelligence space, there is a renewed focus not just at showing you dependencies, but differentiating how the metadata are dependent on each other. For instance, if you think about the field to report relationship, is it used as a column or is it used as a filter or a grouping? That makes a tremendous difference on whether changing or deleting a field, will actually break those reports or not. The other thing is telling you or being able to tell you how many references are you actually looking for and where, so you don't end up going on a wild goose chase. And most importantly, all of us working on Salesforce or on any software, at the end of the day, we work with tasks and to-do lists, whether that's Jira or whatever other ticketing system, could be Salesforce itself. So just having a list of my dependencies is not good enough. There needs to be a way to actually put that into an actionable backlog items and then prioritize and work on them as needed. So again, one of the modern tools in a change intelligence toolkit is having some capability to not just report on dependencies, but actually be able to qualify the nature of those relationships down to how many times something is referenced, how it's being used, how the data flows through it to accelerate that assessment as much as possible. Now, the third challenge within change intelligence area is never knowing who's working on what and when. And this is an interesting one because this is a shared problem with the DevOps space. There are studies on GitHub repositories that have shown that up to 20% of all deployments result in merge conflicts. So let's quickly discuss that in more detail. What is a merge conflict? Let's start there. If I and Ben work on two separate changes, and by some accident we are, let's say, changing the same profile, the same permission set or something. If he deploys his change first and then I deploy mine, there's a chance I might overwrite whatever he's done. That's what we would say it's a merge problem. Now, modern DevOps tools, your Capados, your gear sets, AutoRabbits, all these other great DevOps tools are great at highlighting that there is a potential merge conflict. So they stop you from potentially overwriting and then, in a sense, deleting someone's work. So that helps you to not break things. Now, the challenge is that even though merge conflict alerts stop you from breaking things, they don't stop you from wasting time. So I think it was a couple of months ago, I attended a Salesforce architect meetup in London. And I talked to a pretty senior person from a large consulting partner, and they said in their team of about 60 Salesforce professionals, they spend 2 to 3 days every month, working days every month, resolving conflicts in their deployments. So that's about 10 to 13% of work time, which is a huge, huge cost. The way you can address and fundamentally eliminate that problem altogether is if you shift left. And what that means is you plan and document what metadata you're going to touch and how upfront, as opposed to trying to figure this out at the deployment stage. So a very useful, almost universal capability in change intelligence toolset is something that allows you to document the scope of your work before you start building. That way, you can potentially identify the conflicts at the before anyone even starts configuring the metadata, and that helps with planning. Maybe you go first, we wait till you're finished, and then we'll start. And the fourth big issue that falls under the change intelligence category is your org well architected? Is it healthy? So again, if you remember, there are hundreds of different metadata types, and there are rules. What makes, what is a good Lightning page in terms of performance, in terms of complexity? What is a good flow? What is a good Apex class? What are some best practices to follow? And there's a lot to it. There's a lot of things that is very difficult to remember with so many different components, each one having slightly different behaviors. For instance, one of the number one unspoken challenges in any org is API versions. Very few people know this, but every architect knows this, but it's not that popular knowledge outside of the architect community that when Salesforce makes a release 3 times a year, your flows, your Apex classes, Visualforce pages, other components are not automatically updated to the latest version. You need to actually manually make that transition. And there are plenty of orgs which have flows and Apex and other automations which are years, not 1 or 2 releases, 5, 10 years sometimes behind the latest capability of Salesforce, which means the automations don't have access to the latest capability. You're also missing on years worth of bug fixes and enhancements to your automations. We all know flows should have fault paths, but based on our analysis, most flows don't. On average, that's less than 1%. Again, you should try, according to well-architected, not to make your automations too big or too complex. That makes them very difficult to manage and change. And yet, and according to our analysis, more than 25%, or roughly around 25% of apexes and flows are highly, highly complex in any org. Then you've got, the order of execution challenges, right? So making sure you don't have too many different types of automations running after a record is updated or created. That is, one of those challenges which is very rarely addressed in any org. Security concerns, etc., etc., etc. There are so many principles and practices that need to be thought about when implementing new metadata that are often forgotten. The way you can deal with that is if you have, whether that's, usually with change intelligence, a good org analytics capability, something that helps you to slice and dice your org by all those different attributes, all those different areas of your org health, to understand where you might have problems and where you might need to focus your attention. So that we're coming to an end, and then I want to give some actionable tips. The reality is, and I've tried to come up with some positive ending to all of this. How can you manage your enormity of your Salesforce org, and more specifically metadata and dependencies in some way? And the reality is, it is difficult. After all, as I said, we're dealing with a couple of hundred metadata types, hundreds of thousands of individual components, and then probably millions of dependencies between them in any good-sized org. So it is an extreme challenge. Reality is, and I strongly believe that you need some change intelligence capability, because there's just no way you can manage all of that complexity and enormity with spreadsheets. That being said, if you don't have change intelligence capability today, nor do you have a business case to get one anytime soon, how at least can you get started? This comes back to the webinar we did with Salesforce Ben on flow architecture. But I would strongly recommend, starting from your next project, next change, use diagrams to design and document your automations. If you think about what modern change intelligence tools are trying to do, they're trying to analyze your metadata, find those dependencies for you. And it's a huge, huge task. However, they can only go so far. If you actually document and design how things work in your org, you can add certain notes and comments and why we did it this way as opposed to that way, which no system would ever be able to automatically populate for you. And that actually is a good foundation, or very solid foundation for change intelligence. We have, I'm proud to say, change intelligence with our Jira system, which is not unlike Salesforce, extremely configurable. And most of that comes from our ability to review the diagrams, the workflows, data models we've put together that explain how our Jira is put together. Now, if you absolutely have to, I would actually suggest you could document some key and especially external integrations in spreadsheets. Well, it's very difficult to keep track of all of it, and there's always a challenge of making sure whether that picture, that data is still up to date. The reality is it's still better than doing nothing. And seriously, I cannot recommend this enough. If you don't have change intelligence capability today, get started on building a business case for some change intelligence solution, because especially with how complex orgs can get, this is a must-have to get that complexity under control. Before we get into Q&A, if you'd like to learn more about how Elements helps to address all these problems. You can scan this QR code and visit our website. And on that note, I'm happy to now get into the Q&A.
Let's do it. Thanks so much, Savory. Super interesting. If you've got any questions for Savory, then please drop them in the comments. I can see a few coming in right now, but just to kick us off, actually, one for me. I remember when I used to run a Salesforce consultancy, working on a project, and it was an existing customer that we came into, and they were using Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Community Cloud, fairly custom. And this was probably, I don't know, 6 years ago or something like that. And even 6 years ago, it was a nightmare for them. They'd say they make one change in Service Cloud and it will break Community Cloud, and vice versa with all that. So is it safe to say that as Salesforce evolves and there's more products being added on, more metadata with things like flows, is it getting more complicated to make changes in Salesforce?
Well, I think Salesforce very smartly has decided to address some of these problems. So I think the latest push, it's been in the works for a while, right? But to remove process builders and workflow rules, and make flow the declarative automation of choice, and that's quite likely that maybe other declarative automations will suffer similar fate in favor of flow. I think that's it's a great step, because that, if anything, simplifies your order of execution and things like that. But on the other hand, it is challenging. Salesforce have tried to address it before with dependency API, and that never got out of beta, because actually the challenge of keeping track of all the dependencies is massive. So the only way you can actually do it is, well, either you meticulously document somewhere every like if you build a flow, every field, every record type, every object, every action, you meticulously document everything, and everyone on your team does the same. But the reality is human errors. People forget. It's as soon as you find one issue, one error in that spreadsheet, you really lose trust to all of it. So the only way is you do need to have some tooling that just brute forces its way through your XML definitions, your JSON files, and just finds all those dependencies wherever they are. So yeah, I think it is. But I think the good news is that what wasn't there 6 years ago and wasn't really there even 4 years ago, but started emerging over the last few years, is that whole change intelligence domain, which starts to address those problems. So kind of like, it was very difficult to deploy changes or roll back changes in Salesforce until the dawn of DevOps tool set came about. I think we're seeing a similar thing happening now around planning and managing change.
Yeah, no, super interesting. I think it's also like, it's probably safe to say DevOps is maybe a bit more, DevOps took off a few years ago, but I think change intelligence still embedding itself as a category. But I think as soon as DevOps started becoming so popular, we were advising our readers to make sure you skill up and learn, because if you're in a few years time, probably around now, if you're looking to change jobs, if you've got those DevOps skills and you know how to run DevOps programs, best practices, etc., you're more attractive as a candidate, and it's probably going to be very similar with change intelligence very soon as well. So going into your questions now, thank you for submitting them. I see a few of them coming in. There's one here from Javid. Is there a visual way of viewing interdependencies?
Say that again.
Is there a visual way of viewing interdependencies between metadata?
Well, I think if we talk less about principles and more about, I think in this context around elements, then yes, we have the capacity to flip between a visual dependency tree view, which does allow you to see the enormity of all the dependencies, but also see if you roll over things, how things are related to each other. But I still argue that a spreadsheet-like experience where you can have all of your table-like experience, really, where you have all of your key attributes available and you can quickly filter down to the ones you're actually looking for. That's what helps accelerate the impact assessment. So quick story about that. Dependency tree, and this is a very common visualization method of showing dependencies as a sort of tree. And this is a mechanism you can see in many tools these days. And it's cool, it's visual, it's engaging. It doesn't get the job done, though, very, very often. And I say that because when you, and I've seen this many times with our customers, when you have a very complex org of key objects or key fields, and they're embedded in lots of other places, it used to be, we will, to maybe Ben's earlier point, we will not make a change to our system because we don't know what will break. And then you visualize things with a dependency tree, and people go from, great, that's a beautiful picture, I will now still not make a change now because I know what will be impacted, because I have 3,000 reports or even 300 reports and 70 list views and 20 flows, and that still seems like a lot of things to go through. So we have had customers who would go, I can take a screenshot of the visual dependency tree and show it to my boss as a justification for why we will not implement the change. So that's why, while this is a useful technique for understanding and getting the first sense of what we're up against, actually being able to focus on those key attributes and filter down and, okay, that's the list I want to work against. Let me work that accelerates impact assessment by a couple of hundred of times, really.
Yeah, nice, very cool. Question that I can answer, super easy. Will there be a recording of this to watch again? Yes, this will be on YouTube afterwards. So it's currently streaming on YouTube as well. I saw a few people had issues with LinkedIn, so you can go over to YouTube. I think the UI is slightly better and it will stay on there afterwards as well. Quite a relevant question I can see here that I think you're exactly the man to answer, Xavery, is can we have AI to find patterns and auto document?
Yes, that is actually a very interesting question. So the short answer is yes. I think what we're seeing in the change intelligence space and market is that the generative AI is a huge opportunity, because when you have a change intelligence platform that already analyzes and keeps track of all your metadata and dependencies and other things, well, you already have all the data. Now you just need to put it through some generative AI for analysis and documentation, and that output can be populated for you. So if we're talking about assessing the quality of automation, if we're talking about automatically documenting it, because let's be honest, hardly anyone ever really does, and all those other best practices, yes, the AI is a huge opportunity here. And we on Element side, we're actually integrating AI into a lot of these use cases ourselves. So yes, that's a very exciting future ahead for org management, that's for sure.
Yeah, nice. I don't fully understand this question, but you might, Xavery. Can we use a tool like dbt and or Lucidchart for visualizing alongside our org?
So I think the DP, I think that's the code scanner, I think, of sorts. The short answer is yes. I mean, obviously you can. The thing about Lucid, well, let me put it this way. You can have, like with any tool, you can have lots of individual tools that collectively help you, get a full picture of your org and of your system. So and achieve change intelligence. So think of it this way: you could have any drawing tool where you capture your business processes and your data models, and you could have a separate tool or widget that helps you qualify or get a sense of how healthy is your org, or are there any particularly important security or technical debt vulnerabilities. And then you could have a separate tool for impact assessment and separate tool for et cetera, et cetera. The problem is, like with anything, if you managing all of those different tools in seamless experience during the change lifecycle is extremely difficult, and things get out of sync. So actually having change intelligence tool that combines all those things and allows you to capture your business processes and your data models and your workflows and associate those with metadata and use that during the impact assessment. That, you know, that helps things keep up to date, whether that's your manual documentation. It helps to generate automatic documentation that much better. So yes, you can. And quite frankly, if you can't have a full change intelligence tool today, it's better to start somewhere. But obviously, it's, in my view, not the most productive approach.
Yeah, makes complete sense. Question here. Can elements help develop a rationale and business value proposition to mitigate tech debt and risk?
So, very good question. I'll kind of divide it up into the technical debt and risk, because I think these are slightly different. So, technical debt is an interesting one. I've heard it many times, especially from consultants. No executive seems to care about technical debt until the system stops working. So it is definitely a challenge of how do you not only understand that you have technical debt, but how do you actually qualify and make in some sense, a business case why technical debt needs to be some technical debt needs to be addressed right now. And there are two approaches to this, because not all technical debt is equal. My CTO always likes to say that, you know, just like with normal debt, it's a question of what is the interest on it. If you have technical debt with, you know, almost 0% interest, then that's maybe not really worth the cost of cleaning it up. And then you have some technical debt which, the longer you wait, the bigger the receipt you'll get when it comes to pay it. So a great example would be, I'll give you two examples. API versions. If you have a flow or an Apex or something, which is maybe 2 or 3 API versions behind the current Salesforce version. Yeah, not ideal, not necessarily a deal breaker. But if you're 10, 15, 20 versions behind, you're missing out on absolute years and years of bug fixes, enhancement improvements, not to mention Salesforce deprecates certain API versions over time. So I don't remember right now, but I think that recently they deprecated version 30 or something like that. And we know that orgs out there, some of our customers who still have, you know, Apex classes on version 33 or something. So, you know, roll back another year and, you know, that they're facing some serious challenges. As far as to answer maybe a specific question, how elements can help, we actually have capability that's coming out by the end of summer, where we will be helping you prioritize and understand impact of your technical debt. So depending on you know, how severe it is and where it is, to differentiate the technical debt that's there but doesn't bother anyone, and technical debt that is absolute must to address. Risk is also an interesting one. I think it's all about risk of changes. So I think right now elements, the way we address that issue is when you plan a change, let's say your story or your ticket, we allow you to associate you know, metadata with that ticket, and then conduct this rapid impact assessment, potentially across thousands of dependencies, to identify the ones that actually matter. And then based on that, you now have to make a determination on, considering I need to change maybe 70 different things, is that a risky change or not a risky change? We have also some capability in the works where we plan to utilize also AI to potentially automate that process and automate the determination. So definitely watch this space.
Great, thank you very much. A few more questions about elements. Can elements help to automate profile, permission set, and permission set group documentation? Maybe being asked because obviously permissions on profiles are being retired sometime in the near future, so possibly that's the reason behind this question. But can elements help? Yes,
and could you just, Ben, repeat the beginning of the question?
can elements help to automate profile, permission set, and permission set group documentation?
Very good question. So yes, but there's more coming. So right now, what Elements allows you to do is we help streamline and consolidate profiles, permission set, and groups. So you can run a report of all your profiles and permission sets, and it scores overlap or similarities. And then you can actually have a report that just shows you what are, these are all the things that are similar, but what are the differences? So you can make a smart determination on can I consolidate those things, and are the differences kind of accidental or by design, and therefore maybe I should have a permission set to address those. We also automatically show you with just a click of a button, very easily, everything that a given profile or permission set does. And we do have in the works ability to automatically document that and score that. So to some extent we address it today, but there's more coming. My senior product manager is actually working on it with the idea of delivering something before Dreamforce. So yes, again, watch this space.
Nice. And another question about Elements here, very popular today. How can Elements help a company with multi-orgs? They want to standardize the process as a target to have common orgs/instances.
So that's I've been told by our customer success team that's our bread and butter these days, apparently. There is, I think, a specific page on our website dedicated to org mergers and consolidations. Yes, we between there's I think somewhere even a playbook or a process our customer success team shares when customers want to standardize or consolidate the orgs or processes by which they run. Again, because we have very large scale, rapid reporting capability with different configurations and ability to map out your processes and associate processes with metadata, there's plenty we can do there to help with that particular problem.
Nice, that's great. We've got through pretty much all the questions. I'll give it a second just to see if there's any more. If you do have any more burning questions, we do have a bit of time left, so feel free to drop them in. But just a question from me, Xavier. If people want to learn more about change intelligence, are there any good resources online that they can go to?
I'm planning to write a blog on that fairly soon. However, there is, I think if you type in, there's advisory report recently came out, I think maybe late last year or a couple of months ago, change intelligence report by some consultancy called advisory something. If you change intelligence advisory report, just Google that. I'm sure it will come up. And that kind of was one of the very first reports on independent kind of reports on what change intelligence is and what that emerging domain means. But actually, I'm myself in the process of writing a book on that. So hopefully by late autumn, there will be a much more in-depth resource on that subject.
Nice, sounds good. I think it was Invisory.
Yes. Sorry, Invisory, not advisory. Yes.
Yeah, I've just had a look. I kind of set myself up for this question, but if you go to Salesforce Ben and search change intelligence, it's the first one on there. So a few other posts on there, some by Elements as well. So, Leanne has dropped that in the chat. Thank you, Leanne. This is quite an interesting question here about Salesforce best practices. So, what are a few tips on non-negotiable things to do regarding Salesforce metadata? For example, descriptions on fields and things like that.
Non-negotiable best practices. Interesting question. Let me just think about that for a second. I'm trying to give a simple answer. So
you could just summarize all best practices up in a single soundbite. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think I briefly mentioned this before. At the end of the day, no automated tool is able to really give the depth and the insight of human-generated documentation. Even AI, in how it will be applied going forward, it can scan the code, it can scan the flow, it will be able to tell you how it works and even tell you the health of it. It will never be able to explain why it's there. Like, why did we build it? And then what business purpose does it serve? There's a great example. You can have a field which we have some circumstances. There's examples of that which isn't used particularly much, but it's there because it's meant to help in those once in a blue moon situations. So leaving, and that's descriptions, yes, help text, yes, but even going further than that, documenting your as diagrams, your orders of order of execution for automations, you're designing your flows and automation up front. That's a very good best practice. It also it feels like it's investing more time as opposed to just doing it. The reality, it saves time in the long term. I've recently shared on my LinkedIn a big diagram of from our Jira instance of how different workflows and automations are put together. And yes, it did take a bit of time to put it together at first, but now we have a rule, which is you don't change any workflows or automations in our system unless you review and then update that diagram, because then that now has become our one-page understanding of how the system even works. And you cannot capture that level of complexity in a 150 character description. So yeah, I think that's, if I were to pick one kind of really best practice, is design and document through diagrams your workflows, automations, and business processes. That's a must as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think it makes so much sense. Like, when I was a consultant, one of the biggest issues we'd see, like being a consultant for an existing Salesforce org, was no one was maintaining it. It would fall so out of alignment with the business that was rapidly evolving, and no one knew what the original Salesforce was meant to do, or how it was out of alignment. So obviously, if you've got documentation in place, then it makes everything a lot easier. Another question about Elements here. You mentioned Elements is primarily focused on preventing technical debt, but do you have any tools for fixing existing technical debt? Thank you, Alexander.
Yes. So we we have big release coming up in August with new and revamped analytics. And there's an entire dashboard there, which I briefly showed earlier on one of the slides of around technical debt. So identifying outdated API versions, inactive metadata, unused fields, unused reports, unused dashboards. That's the easy technical debt, in the sense that it's very easy to find. Then we have some capability today, quite frankly, to figure out, and it's it really depends on how we define technical debt, because technical debt could be capabilities which no longer are being used and don't serve their purpose, but it also, in a more academic sense, can mean things which were built incorrectly, or making some cuts just to save time at first, and the architecture design wasn't the right one to choose in the long term. I think especially sometimes how code or flows are built and put together is a great example. So we do have a capability to help you report and understand which of your automations are too complex or have too little coverage in terms of fault handling or error handling. Because again, you can build a very a working flow, except for you haven't put in any of the fail safes and best practices to make sure if it fails, you can handle that. So I would technically classify that also as a sort of technical debt. So yeah, we do have capabilities already to help you find that out and prioritize it, and there's even more coming fairly soon.
Nice, great, thank you very much, Avery. And those are all the questions. Thank you so much for submitting all the questions, but for also joining this great webinar. Hopefully the pressure's off now, Avery, because you've delivered yet again another successful webinar. So Thank you very much for joining us today.
I can now start my vacation.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you everyone for joining. Make sure to check out the white paper that's in the chat, and you can learn more about Elements Metadata Explorer. There is another link in the chat as well if you just scroll up a bit. So thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you next time. Bye.